Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures.
Well, you have a stogie tonight?
I have the other half of that thing I smoked the other night.
What was that?
I think it's a Valkyrie.
Oh yeah, the Valkyrie.
Yeah.
Man Award, they do a good stick. AJ
Yeah.
Fernandez. I don't think I've really had a bad one from him. I'm a fan of his. So, congratulations. You sure are a fan of Connecticut's lately, seems like.
Yep. Sure am.
So I had my church over. Can't remember if this was for Thanksgiving or I think it was Thanksgiving. So I had a couple of friends over and church friends, and there was someone from out of town that I had just met, and so I was kind of giving them the third degree and just razzing them a little bit. And I come down with a dark cigar and a lighter cigar, and I said, "Okay, do you want a dark cigar like a man, or would you like a light cigar like a woman?" And he looks at me like, a dark cigar, maybe?" And so one of the other guys that knows me, he says, "Just give me the light cigar." So it was a good time.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm. Nothing like a good old gendered joke. Anyway, so we've made our way quite. I don't know. What are we? 7 episodes in? Is this 7?
I don't know where we're at. I think it's more than that. 8? I don't know where we're at.
Okay.
I'm lost in the timeline.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. What episode we're in?
Yeah, you're supposed to keep track of that, not me.
Well, we've re-recorded so much.
You want to hear a funny story real quick?
Yeah.
So I didn't realize we were recording until like 3 seconds ago.
I was wondering. You didn't see the
I was
countdown again.
like, are we going to get started? What are we doing here?
You
Sorry.
You didn't see the countdown again.
There was no countdown. There's no countdown on my end.
Is it ticking down numbers? Are we recording on your side?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, up in the little corner here, right? There's the little record thing. It tells me we're recording, but I mean, it's not real noticeable unless you look for it. I didn't see any numbers counting down, though, to tell me when we started. It's okay. At least I didn't say anything bad about Max during that time.
Yeah, you got to keep those comments to a minimum when we're on
I know.
On live. Yeah. Well, I think we are on episode 7, and we've made our way through the abolition of man. Hopefully, our viewers have enjoyed going through that with us. Maybe they bought a book and read this for themselves and saw that we weren't making some of this up.
Some of it.
Most of it. But really, that we've only begun to address the question. We've made our way through abolition of man, and we've started giving some solutions, some ideas to be a part of the cultural rebuild. And so the last episode, we talked about catechism and the parents' responsibility to educate their children. And so this episode, we want to talk a little bit about delegation versus abdication and really get into some of the choices that you might have to delegate your the education of your child to. And so, Jay, I know you've thought a little bit about this. Just we can define the terms, and I'll let you talk about it a little bit. But and think of this in a business sense, right? You got a manager at a store, and he has a task that he needs completed, and he has 2 options. He has 3 options really. He has the ability to delegate that task. He can complete the task himself, or he could abdicate and shirk responsibility. So The delegation, you actively choose someone to finish the task that's suitable to the task. You have the doing it yourself, and then abdication happens with sometimes laziness, sometimes a lack of understanding of the task. There's any number of reasons why abdication might happen, but what I'd like to hear from you, Jay, is how does that relate to a parent in the task of educating their child?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that the government makes it super easy to abdicate.
Yeah.
Right, right. Your kid turns 4 or 5 or whatever, and you send him to kindergarten, and the government says, "We'll take care of him for the next 12 years or 13 years, whatever it might be." And oh, you don't have to pay us anything. It's okay. And off they go to the government school, and we don't ever have to think about it.
Yeah.
I was I was reading an article. There's a local news source here in Billings. It's not really a new. Well, it's a news source. Yeah, they say that it's the Billings Herald, and their motto is um, trustworthy, dependable, and sometimes true. And so they write satirical articles. And there was one about a recent decision at a local school district where the school district, nope, I'm confusing articles. Sorry. It was really cold here, and the school district did not cancel school. That's what it was. And all these parents were up in arms on Facebook and, complaining about this and that. And, oh, they should have canceled school, and the kids are going to be cold. And one person was even talking about the long-term health effects of frostbite and these things, these dangers that the school district is bringing to their children. And then the article goes on to talk about how when teachers in the school district tell the kids of the very same parents that they should mutilate themselves by cutting off their genitals, they don't say a word. They're silent.
Yeah, but you might lose an ear to frostbite, Jay.
So all of that is to say they make abdication really easy, and most of our society has just kind of handed them off. And they get up in arms about stuff that doesn't really matter, like, are you going to cancel school because it's cold outside? Well, if it's too cold, keep your kid home. Like, you don't need the government to tell you to keep your kids home. But when they do crazy things like encouraging children to magically transform into a different gender, that we don't say anything about that, right? We've just given that over, and we just kind of look the other way. That's abdication. So your question was, I don't remember your question. I don't get me going on government schools. I forget what we're talking about.
Well, it's probably the fault of the questioner as well, but I'd like to add something to your idea or your article. And this is more just an observation of what's been going on recently. But there have been parents that have woken up to the reality of what's going on in the public school. And I don't know that many parents, knowing what's going on in public schools, would choose this. That's why, it would be a certain act of injustice to send your child knowingly to a public school, and there's other options available to you. But you saw in COVID and post-COVID, people finally seeing what their kids were being taught and then going into the school board and just raising all kinds of havoc, rightfully so. And it's a little late to do that at that point because you've already given them to the government. And I don't think people understand. And hopefully, if you've made it this far with us through the last 5 or 6 episodes, you understand that public education is not a good option for a Christian child. And so there are parents waking up. Hopefully we're able to help in that process, help along. But yeah, abdication is almost sleptwalked into. Is that a word? Sleptwalked? Sleepwalked? Anyway.
No, it's sleptwalked. Go with sleptwalked.
Sleptwalked. I like it. Yeah, both past tense.
We'll have sleptwalked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No,
Thank
you're
you.
right. Yeah, you're right. And I'm not pointing this out to harp on parents. I mean, I'm a
No,
parent too. I've been in the same position, done the same things. Um, I'm just pointing out that societally, it's been going on for generations, and we don't even think about it anymore. Kid reaches 5 years old, and we send him off to school, and there's really no questions asked about it. We just kind of do it,
we
and
assume it.
we assume it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think you're getting at with abdication.
Yeah.
Rather than being thoughtful and thinking through what's the best thing for my kid and how exactly do I go about orienting this child to God and the world He has created, we just kind of, well, this is what you do when the kid turns 5. You send him to kindergarten.
Yeah.
That's abdication.
No. And they don't even know. That's the thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
So now knowledge didn't exist there.
Right.
So
And here's just an illustration of the challenge. This came into my mind just as we were talking about this. Here in my hometown, there are about 16,000 students in the public school system here in the local school district. And there's a number of private schools. And if you take the seats in all the private schools, K through 12, there's probably about 2,000 seats, most of which are full, which means that there's nowhere for these public school kids, the kids who are currently in public school, there currently isn't anywhere for them to go.
hmm,
It's not like they could all leave the public school and go and enroll in the private schools. They don't exist. And so the challenge is a lot more than just, well, take your kids out of public school. You have to actually do something. And, there might not be a whole lot of options depending on where you live and what resources you have available to you.
yeah,
So
maybe
I'm just pointing that out and recognizing that as a reality.
right.
So
Yeah, good point.
yeah, so maybe we'll talk sometime about uh, some of the different things that you can do if you don't have kids yourself. Maybe you're a grandparent or you haven't had kids yet. One of the things would be to start a Christian school. We need more Christian schools in this country, and that might be your calling.
Hmm.
Get one of those things up and running. But that's another episode.
Indeed, it is. So, moving on to obviously the task, doing the task yourself. That would represent homeschool in the situation, right? Um, and you shouldn't think of it as I'm in this all alone, right? I'm doing this by myself. There's tons of support out there for homeschools, different curriculums you can buy, different co-ops, things like that. Anybody that starts looking into homeschool, you're going to find the resources and support. That's a readily available thing. So I don't know that we need to spend too much time on that. Um, but I think you might have a word of encouragement there.
Yeah, I would. I think if we're thinking about generational solutions, there is going to be this period of time where homeschooling is the solution. And it
Hmm.
may be the solution for a lot of people, anyways, but it's going to have to be the solution for a lot of people in this first stage. Because, like I just said, there aren't enough seats in private schools right now to take in all of these people who would come from public schools. And even if all the pagans stay in public schools and just the Christians left, of course, that would upend the whole system, so that would be kind of fun to see. And who knows if the system would survive that or not. But even with that, there's not enough room in the private schools for just those kids. So homeschooling is going to have to be the thing that most parents or many parents turn to, and that's okay. Parents are older than their children. They are more knowledgeable than their children, often smarter or certainly more experienced than their children, and you'll do just fine. You will do just fine. So hop on Google and Google classical homeschooling, and you'll find a whole bunch of different resources. I would encourage you to check out Classical Conversations. They're I don't know if they're in every state. They're in most states. It's a great organization. They do really great stuff. I would start there. Actually, if you're looking for something, I would just go to Classical Conversations and start there.
There's also a resource for adults, and I'll put it in the show notes because I cannot remember if it's Kepler or Kaplan, but it has adult learning, so you could actually educate yourself alongside your child in a way that gives you mastery over a subject that you're lacking mastery in. And so it is, as you know, I don't want to make it sound too simple, but really, you just have to be a couple lessons ahead of your child anyway. But if you're like me and you're public school educated, I'm thankful for all the church education that I received, and my parents were faithful Christians, thankfully. But the the desire that I have whenever we're talking about these things is I want to keep learning, right? I want to jump in. I want to grab a class, learn some Latin, learn some, whatever the classical, method of teaching might be, whether it's poetry or some sort of literature from, um, you know, times past. But those are the things that I would do, and there's a lot of parents out there like that would love to know. Just a quick story: we had a great in Texas. We're part of a great church that helped people homeschool, and one of the things that they did was this co-op, and they taught an omnibus class. Are you familiar with that? An omnibus class?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What these kids were learning was so impressive. The being able to recite Westminster and the Westminster Confession of Faith, and um the diving off into the Iliad and the Odyssey, and doing all these things in a period of 6 months, going twice a week, you know, writing collegiate level essays. It's just mind blowing what children are capable of if you push them, and they love it. They're excited to learn whenever they're in a situation like that. So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
I
yeah,
had dinner with a family a year or so ago from our church, and they got little kids. Well, not little. I mean, they're early teens, mid-teens, um, and the younger one, who's probably 12 at the time, I don't know, around sixth grade, seventh grade, somewhere in there. And he's asking me because I'm a principal at a school. He's he's asking me about the classes that we offer and different things, and he starts talking about his omnibus class and the things that they're studying, and then he's talking to me about these different approaches to Latin, and and how this all this stuff is tied together. This kid's 12 years old and he's talking to me like it's just normal. It's like
yeah,
these are just normal things that people talk about. And I
hmm
had to play along like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Uh-huh, yeah. So he's the smart one in the room, and I'm smiling and nodding. Uh-huh, yep, yeah, oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, that sounds great.
yeah. Genuinely smiling
Amazing.
and nodding. It's wonderful. Yeah,
I know.
that's good. So, yeah, I think moving on from there, um, delegation. There's options, and there's really kind of a not so good, good, better, best, right?
Yeah, so if you've decided that you're going to delegate some of the educating process to someone else, which is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's a good thing. Um, we had some electrical work done in our house here, and even though I'm in charge of the house and it's my responsibility and all that, I delegated some of that work to someone who knew what he was doing. So delegation is not a bad thing. But when you start to look at options that are out there, one of the things that I would encourage anyone to do, first of all, is to look at the philosophy that's behind the approach that's being taken. And so I'll just give you a really brief overview of, I mean, there's really four approaches to education. And so I'll give you the title of each of those and kind of the philosophy behind it. And then along the way, Cole, you can ask questions if you want to, and we can stop for a little bit and analyze one or more of them in a little bit more detail along the way if that would be helpful. So uh, I'll start with what the government schools do. And the government schools, it's interesting if you look at the history of it. They were really built around the factory model in the Industrial Revolution. And when states started passing all of these laws and including it in their constitutions that kids actually had the right to be educated, suddenly the governments were looking around like, well, how in the world are we going to do that? Like, how we're going to educate every single child? And so basically, they needed to mass produce educated kids. And it's around the time, following the Industrial Revolution, and they came up with the idea of, well, let's do it like we do in a factory. We'll take all of the kids and we'll categorize them, and at this stage they'll do this thing, and at this stage they'll do this thing, and the school itself will be built like a factory, and they go here for this, and then they go to this thing here, and it'll be driven by bells the whole time, and and it's a very sort of cookie cutter approach. And in that, the goal was then one of two things, and this is will be the first two philosophical approaches to education. Uh, it either takes the approach of a prep school, and sometimes when we hear that, we think like a whole bunch of yuppies running around in Richville. But what's really meant by that is a preparatory school that's preparing the student for post-secondary education. And this is what most of us went to who went through public school. We take the sciences that we need in order to get into a science program in college. We make sure we get all the math classes that we need in order to, do whatever it is that we need to do with math when we get to college. If we're focused on the humanities, maybe we want to take an extra history course or something like that. But it's all designed to prepare us to be successful when we move on to the next stage of academic pursuit. So it's a prep school. Not all prep schools are government schools. Obviously, there's some great private prep schools that are out there, but philosophically, their approach, what they're trying to do is train the student to be successful at the next stage. That's the goal.
I used to work at Colorado Christian University as an admissions counselor, and so I dealt with students coming out of high school and mostly adults that maybe failed the first time around going through college. And it is interesting that generally the prep style or the preparatory philosophy of school is the majority report.
Yeah.
Like
Yes.
it's everywhere.
Yes.
Secondly, and it might be a digression a little bit, but humor me. It just kind of struck me the way you talked about, school is mimicking a factory. So it's almost as if the disintegration of the family, and going back to C.S. Lewis, the disintegration of the family was very purposeful because that inherently moves someone away from the Tao, right? And so you untether a child from its parents. The family's been disintegrated. And if you haven't untethered them completely from the parents, you've at least untethered the responsibility from the parents to educate that child, thereby separating them from the doubt, right? And so it seems very purposeful, but it's whenever you put it in the factory terms, it seems cold and clinical and mechanical, and it's interesting whenever you do any kind of reading with C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, or other Christian writers of the era. They really had significant concerns about the Industrial Revolution and what they were witnessing around, and the type of humans that created. And it's really amazing to think that we are so far downstream of that. We only ever discuss the Industrial Revolution as a good thing.
Yep.
And so what they're really doing long term, post secondary, so you got your preparatory, you got post secondary, we're really just churning out more workers. That's all we're doing. More labor. It's all about the labor. And that's how you treat slaves,
Yep.
right? You want them to do a specific job, and that's it. You don't want them to be able to think. You want them to be able to do what you tell them to do. And you might feel like you have a certain amount of freedom in choosing what you do, but really you're kind of funneled towards your aptitudes. And you go to the school counselor and they tell you what you'd be good at, and they kind of pigeonhole you, especially when you're right out of high school, into saying, now wouldn't this be nice? And there's just a lot of career coaching and all these things, but it's all about benefiting the new society that they're building. And more, not, whenever I was in school, it wasn't as heavily geared towards that, but it just seems like that is the direction. So
Oh yeah, it
again,
absolutely is.
yeah,
It absolutely is. And what do you ask a graduate? Like if you go to a graduation party, what's the question you ask him?
usually, where are you going to school?
Okay,
Where are
where
you
are you
going to
going to school?
college? What are you going to do?
You know, what are you
Yeah,
going to do?
yeah,
You know what no one ever asks the graduate? What kind of human are you going to be when you walk out of here?
yeah.
And it's just ingrained in us that school is there to prepare you to go to college. Or then the second one that I'll talk about is a vocational approach, or it's to give you some kind of a marketable skill that you can then take into the workforce and use. And and neither of those things are bad. I mean,
Right.
I, I obviously went to a lot of college, and it was good to be prepared for it. I wish I had some marketable skills. That'd be really nice. Um, so those things aren't bad. In fact, those things are good. But when we reduce the student down to just that, when we reduce his education down to merely, let's make sure that you have the content in your background in order to take this class in college, or let's just make sure that you have this skill that you can use on this project or whatever to earn a paycheck. When we reduce it down to that, boy, we've really missed something. And I think maybe this is what C.S. Lewis was getting at in that great statement. I think it's in chapter 2, where he says, the task of the educator is not to cut down jungles, but it's to irrigate deserts. It's to bring these kids alive and make them into something human. But what we end up doing with this cookie cutter factory approach is we end up taking some of the humanness out of them.
Yeah, it's so good. So good. So moving on to vocational schools.
Yeah. And so government schools have taken this approach too, where not everybody wants to go to a post-secondary school. Not everybody should go to a post-secondary school. And I think particularly now, I'll just throw this out there, as post-secondary schools have gone crazy, I would like, who wants to go there anyways? Even the people who would be going there now, they're like, well, there's not a whole lot of value in it anymore. And so everybody's looking for a marketable skill. The thing that I hear most commonly in conversations that I have in the world of education with parents and with administrators is it keeps coming back to career readiness and making sure that these kids are ready for a job when they get out. And they should be ready for a job. That's not the only thing. They should be ready to live life. So anyways, point being, vocational education is so the other thing that the government schools have adopted. So where it's this sort of twin pronged approach where most of the kids go through some kind of prep program where the objective is prepare you for whatever academic studies you're going to pursue after high school. And the other is some kind of vocational program. And most, at least major school districts, will have some kind of a, we have a career center is what they call it here in town, where kids can learn all sorts of things. Well, then my brother teaches there. Actually, he's the construction teacher. They actually build a house every year, which is kind of cool. It's a great skill to have, but there's a lot more to education than just acquiring that skill.
Hmm. Or do you see a possible market that Christians are missing in vocational and technical schools? Because you hear about Christian schools all the time, whether it be classic or preparatory but I rarely hear, you know, Christians excelling in that area. So just because just like you say, not everybody should go to post secondary education. Not everybody should do these different things, but everybody needs a skill of some sort. They've got to provide for their families and so on and so forth. It just seems like that could be maybe a place where somebody gets excited about it and um, continues education to develop good humans while also giving a technical skill. And I'm talking post secondary. I'm obviously not talking about high school at that point.
No, you ask a great question, and it's actually come up before. We've had these discussions, even at my own school, of, could we and should we offer some kind of vocational something? Um, and it's an ongoing discussion that we're having. We have not reached a conclusion. But my personal view is that in the grammar and middle school and high school years, those are formative times where
Yes.
the objective has to be that we are forming a biblical worldview in their mind, and we're shaping the student's character into the image of Christ. And we're using our pursuits of study of natural revelation and physics and math and history and literature and these things. We're using those things as tools to do that, so that by the time they reach the age of a high school graduate, 18 years old, 19, 20, by the time they get there and they're starting to go out on their own into the world, that they have this foundation on which to stand. And at that point, then they should consider really pursuing gaining some kind of marketable skill. Um, and so your question was, are post-secondary Christian schools missing something?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting question. Um, and my answer is possibly, but I think there's another side to it, which is the whole apprentice model. Um, so my son uh, got out of high school, and his soccer coach worked at a diesel shop. And my son's interested in trucks and engines and things of that nature. And so he just went and got a job as a shop hand with this guy for a year. And what he learned in a year, unbelievable.
I bet.
And now, a year and a half, 2 years later, he's working as a diesel mechanic at a dealership. And so there's, whether Christian schools are missing the opportunity or not, I'm not sure. I don't know, maybe. But what I know for sure should be happening is we should have Christian men in the church who have a skill, who
Mhm.
should be willing to have the younger men apprentice with them and learn that skill from them. Um, that should definitely be happening.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point.
Yeah.
We need to bring back apprenticeship, especially considering all the developments in AI, and we see, you know, interesting things coming down the pike that the trades are going to be very important in the next decade or so. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah, let's bring back apprenticeship for sure.
Yeah. Yep. Hashtag apprenticeship.
hmm That will be on this episode's tags. We will put hashtag apprenticeship.
Yep. That's great.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm going to mention one other philosophical approach to education before I get to the right one or the correct one. That was a joke, but not
Spo-
really.
Spoiler alert: Jay thinks one is correct.
Yeah, spoiler alert. All these are trash that I've gone through so far. It's true. And yeah, it's true. And I think you'll agree with me within, I don't know, if not this week, by next week or at some point anyway. No, Montessori. You've all heard Montessori before. It maybe 20 years ago became more of a fad kind of thing. Some Montessori schools started to pop up around, and the philosophy behind it. And there's going to be some Montessori person who's like, oh, that's not what Montessori really is. That's fine. You can critique my description of it here all you want, because I'm honestly not that familiar with it. But sort of the underlying philosophy is that the child should really be out discovering things himself, and there's some truth to that. Like kids are naturally inquisitive, right? They explore and they do things and they figure things out, and that's a good thing. But the Montessori approach sort of, I'm going to say boxes it, but they would certainly disapprove of me using that terminology. Um, but they take that inquisitive nature of the kid as the only thing that he should be doing, just about.
Hmm.
And so they really give the kid just free reign to explore and do whatever it is that he is inclined to do. And in that exploration process, he learns about himself and he learns about the things that he sees and interacts with, and he learns about the other kids who are around. And so it's there's good to it, but there's got to be limits to it at the same time. Um, and here's what I mean by that. Like, those of us who have raised kids or who have little kids, um, like we want them to like run around and explore and figure stuff out,
Hmm.
like in the backyard, right? We don't just open the front door and kick them out in the morning and say, well, whenever you get back, like we wouldn't take a 6-year-old and throw him out and say, go figure out the world and, let us know when you're done. We would give him parameters,
Mhm.
and we would give him the path, basically, that we would lead him on to discover the things that we want him to discover, and um, and try and give him the tools to interact with those things. And so,
Yeah, and so Montessori school does that. They do give parameters, and they try to direct, but what you're saying is the parameters should be a little more
yeah,
tight.
yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly what I'm saying. That
Yeah.
they should be a bit more tight. We should control what the kid is actually looking for. We should control what the kid actually finds, and we should control how he then analyzes the thing that he finds. Um, so think about this. Suppose you are a missionary to some remote place where they don't know anything about the gospel, and you show up and you start talking to them, and somehow they're atheists, right? Which of course those don't exist in these remote places. They're all pagans, but let's just say they're atheists. And you have a few conversations with them, and they say, Cole, we're kind of interested in this concept of religion. You wouldn't say, well, why don't you go out there and see what you can figure out about it,
Hmm.
right? It doesn't work that way. If you want to know about religion, you read the Bible.
Right.
If you're looking anywhere else, you're not going to find the right information. And so we have to make sure that we're giving them objective truth and helping them interact with that objective truth. So the Montessori tries to, what's the word, capitalize on the kids' natural inquisitiveness, which is a good thing to do. But there's a lot more to education than that. And most Montessori schools will be elementary schools or maybe sometimes through the 8th grade. But that's typically about as far as they go. Parents are excited by, oh yeah, let's have little Johnny, play around and explore in class. But by the time he's 14 years old, they're like, okay, we need you to learn some physics now. So you're going to go take some real classes.
It sounds like it's the logical end of subjectivism to me. And like you say, there's some things that are good with it, but it sounds like it would be very easy to fall off into a liberal viewpoint in that kind of a situation where you know you're you're encouraging kids to find out things for themselves. And, you know, speaking from a Christian worldview, you know, kids, they're born in Adam, right?
Right.
They have a sin nature, and they're going to naturally incline to sinful activity. And so it seems like Montessori it'd be difficult to um, clamp down on that in a helpful way. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the weaknesses. They give a little bit too much freedom and not quite enough direction. And when that happens, I mean, when you're dealing with children, like they don't have a starting point.
mm,
They they've got to start somewhere and be pointed in a direction and be given, the tools along the way. Um, so there's absolutely a place for kids learning and discovering and searching and growing and exploring and all of that. Absolutely. But it's got to be within the right context.
and another digression, but I think it is relevant here. We talked a little bit about catechizing your children last episode, and we didn't really talk about doing that in the context of family worship, but it's often told to parishioners or churchgoers that when you catechize your kids, do it in the context of family worship, because what you're doing is teaching them to worship in the big church, let's say, right? So whenever they come to big church, you're teaching infants to sit still through family worship, and you're really, again, I hate to reuse a word over and over again, molding this child into the church member that they need to be to receive optimum benefit from revelation. So it seems like you would want to design your education off of that model where you're providing um you know where you're providing actual steps to become that better person.
Right.
uh,
Yeah,
you
we
know
should know where we want the kid to end up.
mm-hmm.
I mean, when I did my master's program in education, and we're talking through the nature of lesson planning, and I didn't do an education bachelor's degree, and so a lot of this was new to me, and it was so simple. The very first thing when you're writing a lesson plan is you need to have an objective, which is where you want to be at the end,
Right.
right? And then you work your way back from there. And so we don't just start at the beginning and tell the kid, well, go for it. And I bringing in the worship service, I think, is a great example. We don't walk into a Sunday service on Sunday morning and tell little Johnny, okay, go worship God however it is that you want to, and figure it out. Like
And why
God
is
has,
that?
because he's going to do it wrongly.
He's going to do it wrongly. Yeah.
God
Yeah.
has given us a prescription for how to do these things, and He's given us a prescription for discovering objective truth, and He's told us what our relationship is to that. And so there's certainly a place for discovery, but it's guided discovery at best.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think that is going to be something to think about. I don't know how many Montessori schools are out there. You said it's kind of faddish, and so it may have. I've heard it maybe once or twice before. We talked about it
Yeah.
earlier. So
No, they're around, and there's some good schools out there actually. Especially if you were delegating to the school specifically that sort of exploratory aspect of the education,
mm,
and you want to use a Montessori school to do it, go for it.
right,
As long as the kid's getting everything else at home or in some other context. And there's some great Montessori schools out there. There's one here in town, Grace Montessori. It's a good school run by great people, and they do really good stuff. Um, I just prefer a different approach,
sure,
which I'll mention now.
yeah, you should. What is that approach? What is that approach, Mr. Bolt? Please tell me.
Classical Christian education.
Mm,
And in my mind, classical and Christian is redundant. When I say classical education and when I say Christian education, I'm talking about the same thing. So you'll hear me use those terms at different times, and I'm talking about what most people would call CCE or classical Christian education. I think there's really only one genuine classical education, and that would be classical Christian education. And we'll see how many enemies I can make with this. I also think there's really only one genuine Christian education, and that would be classical Christian education. And so when I say classical education or Christian education, I'm talking about the same thing. And philosophically, here's how classical Christian education differs from these other approaches. It really goes back to Van Til's definition of education that we've been using, that the education is the process of orienting the kid or the student to God and the world he has created. And that is not what a prep school does. A prep school makes sure that you have the right science and math content in order to get into the engineering program at Montana Tech. That's what a prep school does. It's not
Yeah.
what a vocational school gives you a marketable skill. It doesn't orient you to God and the world he has created. And a Montessori school kind of puts you out in the world and is like, here, figure it out. But it's not actually orienting you objectively, and that's the key. That there is an objective orientation that a child should have to God and the world that the child is living in. So philosophically, that's the approach. And historically, the reason we use the term classical education is because this is the approach that's been taken for thousands of years, going all the way back to the Greeks and even the Hebrews in ancient Israel. Gosh, what was I thinking about the other day? Boy, I can't even remember what it was now. I was reading somewhere in the Old Testament, and they were referring back to the law and quoting certain things out of the law, and it was evident that everybody in this family, and I can't remember where this was now off the top of my head, but it was evident that they all knew how to read, that they all interacted with written text.
Mm-hmm.
And it was part of their culture to interact with written text because that was the way in which God had revealed himself. And so anyways, my point here is that this approach goes back to the very beginning of time, and it goes to the question of how do we enculturate our children up into the kingdom of God? Well, we're going to expose them to the Word of God, and we're going to expose them to God's natural revelation, which is creation. We're going to expose our children to mathematics. We're going to expose our children to God's redemptive acts in history. We're going to expose our children to the study of the hard sciences and see how God is revealed in those things so that we can know him better and thus be oriented to him accurately. And from that, learn more about the objects around us that he has created, their actual meaning, the meaning that he has given them, and what our relationship is to them, and thus live fruitful lives in this beautiful world God has made. So that's the approach philosophically. And let me just say this much, that if you do that, if you take that approach and you use history, literature, mathematics, science, the arts, whether that be fine arts or performance arts, music arts, whatever those things, any or all of those things, if you use all of those as tools to study God and his world, and you do that for 12 years, right, from first grade through 12th grade, you will be more prepared for any post-secondary school than anyone who went to any prep school. And you will be more prepared for the marketplace, the economic marketplace, in terms of soft skills. You may or may not have any hard skills, but in terms of soft skills, interacting with people, because at the end of the day, a business is made up of people with skills, but it's still made up of people, and you've got to work with people. And so someone who goes through a classical education is going to have more of those soft skills than anyone who went to any vocational school. And they will discover way more than anyone who goes through the Montessori process.
Wow. I'm convinced.
That didn't take much. Wow.
No, no.
That's
I
amazing.
well, the way you framed it, it is convincing to me, and I think some of it that has helped is I've witnessed the effects of a classical education on all stages, right? You got your grammar, you got your logic, you got your rhetoric, and I've seen and obviously this is anecdotal. I'm not bringing statistics to bear here, but I've seen kids that have been educated in this manner excel, excel in college, excel in career, excel in their churches, excel in their businesses. The entrepreneurial spirit is high in these types of kids. And it's really building the human to build more institutions, to build God's kingdom. And that's what we want. We don't want this, highly segmented um, society that is highly compartmentalized because everybody's so specialized in so many different, in one thing, and it's very atomistic. Whereas the kingdom of God is very molecular, and these relationships are built, and there's uh, there is still specialization. Don't get me wrong, but there's there's an educated human behind the
Right.
specialization that
Right.
doesn't just understand science or doesn't just understand math, but is really well rounded. Um, it is something that we look for is a well-rounded human at the end of this that yes can specialize but is also useful in other areas as well.
Yeah, and again, we're just talking about the philosophy behind these different approaches to education.
Sure.
There's a lot more that I could and will maybe next time say more specifically about classical education. Um, but the objective is to end up with a well-rounded human being
Yeah.
who understands how the world works, understands something about civics and economics, something about social society and his role in that society, something about the nature of parenting and childhood and what the purpose of the family is and um, we seek to instill virtues in the students, not just give them skills to use. So we're really aiming to shape and mold the whole person, not just their intellect, not just their hands, that they can do certain things, but we really want them to be a certain thing, rather than just being able to do a certain thing. And another thing that I'll throw out there, you mentioned the grammar stage and rhetoric and logic stages, or logic and rhetoric stages, and um, I'd be happy to get into more of that. And that's typically called the trivium, if you ever hear that terminology. You also hear folks talk about the quadrivium. That's a sort of another layer of it. I'd love to get into Latin and why classical schools use Latin so much, why it's such a big deal. I mean, it's a dead language. Who cares, right? But there's actually real important reasons for these things. So I'm just throwing some things out there that we can talk about on a later episode. But one last thing that I'll mention that you'll hear talked about in classical circles is the true, the good, and the beautiful. And we're trying to orient kids to appreciate what is good objectively, what is true objectively, and what is beautiful objectively. And in many ways, you can, I don't know if I want to use the term reduce, but you can delineate life down to that. Just the appreciation of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Of course, beginning with God, who is good and is true and is beautiful, and the world he has created, and the goodness in it, the truth in it, and the beauty in it. And I mean, that in many, many ways is what this life is about. And so philosophically, that's what the classical approach aims to do: orient the kid to God and the world that he has created.
That's good. We have a few episodes left of this season, and then we're kicking around some ideas. I think we've settled on season 2. I'm really excited about that. We'll unveil that shortly.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too.
It's going to be a lot of fun.
It's going
So
to be a good one.
yeah,
Yeah, we'll have to throw some teasers out there. Get people's mouth watering just a little bit.
yeah, yeah. Let's do that. Let's engage some Pavlovian response.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So here's a teaser for you. It will include the word revolution.
Mm. Mm.
Now, what we're going to say about it, I don't know. Well, I do know, actually, but you don't know yet.
I do know.
Well, you know, yeah. Our listeners don't know yet, but it'll include the term revolution.
Yeah, yeah. That is quite the teaser. So it's exciting. Looking forward to it, and we're super appreciative of you taking the time to listen to us talk. Well, to Jay talk and me ramble. And please, 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 I can't say this enough. Comment, even if you think it's just irrelevant. It's not. We need that not only for the algorithm, but we really want to interact with you and like, subscribe, share. And we're going to get into some one-off episodes too. It's not just seasons. We're gonna have some fun this year, so we're looking forward to that. And any suggestions you guys might have on a topic you'd like to see us tackle, please submit it. We are open to new things to discuss and to examine in the light of the Scripture. So until then, we will see you hopefully this time next week, which, Lord willing, will happen.
The kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword upon